Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. You will listen to an interview where we talk about cows, kiwis, and investing in New Zealand, where regenerative agriculture is really taking off. Enjoy! Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered. Podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! So welcome to the podcast. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host. Today I'm joined by Geoff Burke, founder of Agro-Ecological, all the way down in New Zealand. This is an experiment where we try to dive deep into regenerative agriculture projects on the ground, and where we're also recording video as we go over the projects with Geoff today. Find all the links below in the description and please let us know what you think. Agro-Ecological is a New Zealand-based impact investment manager and advisory firm focused on farmland. Welcome, Geoff.
Morning, thank you, and good evening.
Yeah, good evening, good morning. We're very far apart, and there's a slight delay sometimes in the connection, so it's a good experiment to do. For the first time, actually, on this podcast, we have a video connection, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that turns out. But to start with a personal question, why and how did you end up in soil? I mean, you are from New Zealand, where farming is a huge industry, but still you could have chosen many other career paths.
Yes, it's a good question. I'll try and keep it short. We could be here all morning/evening. So essentially, I'm from a farming background. Was brought up on a beef and sheep property. My father always said that if we had a restaurant, we would have done it from paddock to plate. So the family was involved with farming, livestock buying, butchery, meat exporting. So pretty much everything else except restauranting. So I think it's kind of in you and you have an appetite for it. And, I went and studied it at university, but I think like a lot of young men in the 1980s who were from farming backgrounds, I ended up in investment banking because farming wasn't looking terribly clever. I don't think in many places in the 80s. So, but I just got to that point in life where I think I couldn't escape my genes, and they started sort of vibrating particularly strongly. And so ended up pursuing particularly organic agriculture because I got interested, firstly because I was involved with futures and options. I started to get interested from the deal point of view because this organic stuff seemed a lot more expensive. So therefore, did that mean the farmers were making more money? And, having covered some of it at university, I could sort of intellectually get my head around it and that New Zealand would probably be quite good at it. And so that's why I went back and did my postgraduate work back in New Zealand at Lincoln University. And then it sort of expanded from there. So, yeah, that's trying to keep it short. That's how we got into it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because otherwise we could easily cover a full hour probably on this.
Easy.
So tell me, Agro-Ecological, what it is, what you do, who is we in that sense, how many people are you, and why? I mean, you are from New Zealand, but what's the reason of the base in New Zealand?
Well, we are in New Zealand now, but started off in the UK. I've spent probably 20 out of the last 25 years in the UK.
Because you lived there for a long time, yeah.
Yeah, that's right, and worked at the Organic Research Centre over there in Berkshire for a number of years. So came back to New Zealand about 5 years ago. So yeah, I mean the name is because it's kind of does what it says on the tin. It's one of those names that captures exactly what it's about. And I think just what we wanted to try and achieve. So we're a small team. There's just a handful of us. But I think what we really wanted to try and achieve was genuine transformation to drive change. And one of the limiting factors around the perception of ecological agriculture or regenerative agriculture, however you want to term it, is that it is less profitable and that people do it purely for philosophical, almost as religious reasons. And, my experience of having been on a lot of farms is that was wrong, and particularly here in a New Zealand context, that you had the ability to create a more profitable system, particularly if you could capture a premium, but even potentially without capturing that premium, you had the ability to run a leaner, more resilient system. And so really it was about that. It was about proving that we could create a system that was more environmentally positive and that we would also drive good, if not better, financial returns, and being able to demonstrate that through actually doing it. So that's really sort of how it came about, if you like.
And it's really based, because we use the term organic a lot, we use the term regenerative a lot. For you, it's really it's almost a step. I mean, organic is the official certifier, but you cannot really be organic, or the official certification, you cannot really be organic without being regenerative, at least in your experience and in your circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I view it. I know there are different views around the world and people who say there's sort of corporate organic and stuff like this. But for me, if you're doing it as well as you possibly can, then you're relying on ecological science or agro-ecological science. So if you like, being regenerative is a byproduct of implementing sound, robust, best, if you like, agro-ecological management practice, which QED makes you organic because all those techniques are things that fall within the sort of the specifics of organic certification. And really organic is just, the way I view it is that organic is important because it's a stamp. It's independently audited and it gives consumers some comfort, and that drives the premium. And that's important because it makes it more profitable. And the more robust and profitable it is, and the more likely it is to drive more money into it and then see more organic agriculture being rolled out. And, it's been successful for 20, 30 years, but really hasn't expanded, perhaps as much as we need it to, thinking about climate change and other sort of environmental challenges, and thinking about how much capital goes into agriculture as a whole, and how much of that goes into organic. And
research as well.
Yeah, exactly. So there's still a fraction of capital flow going into, this very important, or what we view as a very important area in terms of creating good food, creating good environmental outcomes, adapting to and dealing with climate change and the consequences of climate change.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the next picture as you see the soil from underneath. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in organic, where many people see it as just replacing the chemical inputs you're using with some organic inputs, probably getting a lower yield if you do that. Like if you don't push the system as far as you're doing, as you're mentioning, you can really push it much further, meaning that you get a lower yield, which are usually the farms you see in ending up in research. And thus you have that tendency of saying we cannot feed the world with this because everybody has 20 or 30% lower yields, which is not the case. If you look at, it really depends where you take these examples. Plus there's only a fraction of the money went into research so far, meaning that we're really at the beginning. I've seen farms that are maybe 5 or and sometimes even 10 times better in yields. And you're mentioning before, and actually Nicole, we should focus on profit per acre and not yields per acre. But we haven't pushed the organic system as far as we can in yields, but also in profits and also in quality. And we're just at the beginning. It's a 20, 30 year thing, and compared to 50 or 60 maybe. So there's an interesting discussion going on around that, which makes me always feel a bit uncomfortable if people say, but can you actually feed the planet with that? And I say, yes, if you do it well, but that's always the case. If you do it in a bad way and you just replace a few things here and there, of course you can't, because you're a bad farmer, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not really a question, but it's more a statement.
Yeah. No, but it's a good one because it does come up. And then we get into the whole debate, well, why is it that people are going hungry? Is it because we're not producing enough food? Well, in the West, we've got sort of high obesity levels. So clearly we're not lacking producing food.
Yeah, it's about 2.5 billion with obesity.
So it's much more about logistics and availability and poverty and these types of things. So we don't have an inability to produce sufficient food. We absolutely do. And from an organic perspective, certainly the systems I know well, there is minimal yield penalty, if any. And certainly, from our point of view, from pastoral point of view, from permanent crops such as kiwi fruit, there is no reason why we wouldn't be in the top 3-5% purely for production, certainly in terms of profitability. So,
yeah, why is that? Because we're going to dive into dairy and kiwi in a minute, but let's dive a bit into the nuts and bolts of not doing it the conventional organic way, just replacing a few inputs from chemical to organic and then calling it a day. No, you're saying organic is meant to be, and I've had this discussion before where people say the spirit of organic is constant tinkering and constant changing, and that's how they designed it. Now the certification in some places is very rigid, but that wasn't how the original pioneer started. And so what's let's say your take? You can take a concrete example. We might go into kiwis later on, but if you want to take a concrete example now, what would be your definition of regenerative organic?
Well, you raise an interesting point, and this is one we often talk about, and that is that it's often perceived to be, so organic agriculture is often perceived to be a case of substituting conventional inputs for organic inputs. And so that's fundamentally flawed. That's not what it is. And those are usually the systems that fail. And so, for instance, you'll see farmers who say, organic doesn't work. I've literally had that conversation with someone, but they had effectively gone down that input substitution route. So take the conventional input out, put the organic one in. And so that doesn't work. And, if someone was going to adopt that approach, we could tell them beforehand, before they even got started, that it isn't going to work. Because what you need to do is redesign your system, or if you like, even say put in place a new system. And that's about management, and it's about, what's going on up in here just as much as it is what's going on down in the soil and the pasture. So that's where you get success, through creating that health, that resilience, and so on in your system. But it comes back to that management system. It's not just take that thing out, put that one in instead. And that's crucial, because generally most farmers will think that's what it's about, because that's how they've been educated to think of farming.
Is that then the most difficult piece? Like the changing the mind of the farmer, or nudging the mind of the farmer? Or
Yeah, I would say certainly right now, experience in New Zealand is that there are a lot of people who are very interested, more than I have ever seen before. There's much less of the sort of, laughing into your hand or
behind your back.
Yeah, because people are recognizing that actually, the current system isn't working. There's a whole lot of regulation coming in around water quality, because water quality is not great as a consequence of intensive dairying, and people in New Zealand don't like it. I'm sure people anywhere don't like their degrading water quality. And so, that change is being driven. That's not the only sort of change, but through that, it's starting to change. And people are thinking, well, how do I farm to be within the regulations, to be, if you like, to have a social license to farm, and then to also make it profitable so I can continue farming with my family and perhaps pass it on to my sons or daughters or whoever it is. So those sort of questions are really quite in play strongly in New Zealand. And so that means I'm finding that I'm engaging with farmers and talking to them about, well, let's develop the system, let's develop that system, what are you thinking about doing? And everyone that I'm talking with is saying, well, yeah, we're interested in, finding out more about organic. How do we do it? Or, how do we make that system work? So I would say right now, and this is based on our New Zealand experience, that it's a really good time to be seeking to put those systems in place, because I think farmers are very open to that. But certainly that it's up here. That's the most important part of the system to convert. But as I say, the appetite for it, the genuine interest in it is good. And the great thing about New Zealand is that you get a lot of very capable farmers. It's a big sector here. It's a major sector. So capable young men and women go into the sector. We'd probably like to see more going in, but there's plenty out there. And what's interesting is that, if you like, the most motivated ones are the ones who are interested in pursuing this more sustainable line. They have more of an appetite for it. And that's good, because it does require you to be ahead of the curve a little bit, to be in sort of the top 10, 20% of conventional operators. Those are the guys who are going to make it work.
And it puts you aside a bit in your communities. And
yeah.
How big is the farming industry? And you mentioned before in a conversation we had, it's basically, you never have to put the animals inside. It has the perfect climate. Is there changing a lot in the climate as well? Is that like a risk for the next 20, 30 years?
We have a remarkably benign climate. We're very lucky with our climate. So animals can be outside grazing all year round. To some extent, that does depend on your soil, but there are not large parts of New Zealand, certainly not large farming parts, that are under snow. Pretty much nowhere in the North Island will be getting snow in the farm, except up on the peaks, the hills or something. But it's not like Northern Europe or North America. It just doesn't. And grass will grow all year round in large areas of the country. It might slow down or stop in some places in sort of July, the middle of winter. But otherwise, you keep growing. So, to compensate for that lack of pasture growth, you harvest in your peak season and you feed it out in your sub-season. So we've got a fantastic climate. We've also got rain and good soils and sunshine. So we have sunshine, we have heat units, we have water, we have that ability to graze outside all year round. That ability to grow things is the basis of the country's economy, really. There's a certain amount of tourism, which is pretty important, particularly when sort of Lord of the Rings and films like that get made and people come down and visit. But it's really about food production, and that comes back to the climate, the quality of the climate we have, which is a real blessing. And
it's almost all export, I assume.
Yeah, look, there's 4 million people in this country, and I think we produce enough food for, I've heard various sort of measures, but, sort of 40, 50, 60 million. So I think literally 95% of what New Zealand produces is exported. So in the context of the global economy, from an agriculture point of view, we're extremely important. Dairy, I think we're around 1/3 of globally traded dairy product. I think we're the biggest exporter of kiwi fruit. Well, Zespri at least is the biggest exporter of kiwi fruit, the New Zealand kiwi fruit marketer. Lamb, we're the number one exporter of lamb. So, and apples, we're not number one, but we're very big from an export point of view, just because, pretty much everything we produce, whatever it is, will be going overseas.
And just on this slide, one thing I always like to ask, measurable environmental performance. What are you measuring? What would you like to measure? Because it's not always the same thing. And what are customers asking? What are investors asking you're working with? What's has been your experience on the measurement part?
Okay, so those are some interesting questions. So there's been a rise in impact investment, but investors we are talking to seldom, and I think I can only think of one, but they're seldom articulating, we need these particular metrics. We need to see that you're measuring this. Pretty much everyone we talk to are super happy with the approach we're taking, and it's kind of a case of, we say, we're going to measure these things, and they go, wow, that sounds fantastic. So, and I think it's so juxtaposed with what they're otherwise seeing. So there's such a sort of a separation between, if you like, the norm and what we're doing. So in terms of what we would like to measure, well, some of them are relatively straightforward to do, and that's biodiversity is a fairly obvious one. Some are very important, but much more technically difficult to do, which is water quality. But in doing that, there are mechanisms you can use, and then also we're looking to work with regulators in certain catchments who are monitoring water quality, and to do that over time. Some of these things are not quick fixes, but we're quite keen to see how we can record that change and how that happens at sort of a micro level, so at the farm level, and then also in the wider catchment level, particularly if you start to get multiple farms under management, then it'd be interesting to see how you can identify those differences. But otherwise, it becomes things such as, you talk about putting particular environmental mitigations or management actions in place that you say are going to make a difference. So the first thing would be to measure is that, well, have you actually done those things that you said you were going to do? And to some extent, science hasn't caught up with good management practice. So an example of that would be, if you sow a really diverse mixture of pasture, some of that's very deep rooting, and so you're better holding on to nutrient in that soil than if you've just got really very short rooted grasses. Well, that isn't picked up, for instance, in New Zealand in the nutrient monitoring system. So you get no benefit out of having that pasture system versus having, say, a very short rooted ryegrass. So the science to some extent has to catch up in terms of its ability to measure those differences, but nonetheless, those are the sort of things we're putting in place because we know they make a difference from a lot of different points of view, health of the animals and and performance, as well as retaining nutrient and so on and so forth. So,
are you measuring carbon like your big neighbor Australia is doing? As there's a sort of a market there, but I don't know the situation that well in your part of the world.
Just sort of cranking up again, actually. So probably literally the last couple of weeks, carbon has become much more of a topic with farmers that I'm talking to. So there is a billion trees program, as it's called here in New Zealand, where the government is encouraging people to get out there and plant trees. And you may be familiar with Manuka honey. You probably have it on your toast this morning, Koen. And so there's an opportunity there to plant more of that, Manuka and Kanuka, and make oil and honey, and also sort of, lock up some carbon. So it's a really interesting area. It's just growing. Super interested in that because I think, more silver pastoral type systems are something that is of interest to us, and it sort of totally links in with that. So, and it'd be great to be able to measure that and create more income. And so I think that's something that you will see increasing, and it's something we will pursue on farm, without.
Yeah, you're probably one of the fastest ways as well to rebuild soil carbon levels as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, and trees grow super fast in this country. Something that might take 60, 80 years in, say, the UK will grow here in about 2025. So it's, dramatically different. As I say, it's the warm wet just makes such a difference.
Great. You're one of the biggest players as a country. I mean, one of your marketing, the marketing company that most people when they eat a kiwi, at least 1 in 2 or something comes from New Zealand. Why are you pushing for regenerative organic, and why is that such an interesting development at the moment in New Zealand?
So there's the pure market interest. So you attract a premium for being organic, and the market is growing, sharply, North America and Asia. So that's the exciting dollar-driven end of it, if you like, which is quite compelling, and that there is a marked shortage of supply, and the ability to change that rapidly in a short space of time just simply doesn't exist. So that's very compelling. The second thing from a production point of view is that we have identified a sort of unique agronomic advantage in a particular location, and it's connected to how kiwi fruit grow or how they are made to grow. And essentially, kiwi fruit need to have winter chilling. So they need to be...
And that means winter, not chilling in a big warehouse or something.
No, that's right. Not in your fridge. No. Yeah, no, don't put them in your fridge. No, it means you need
to have a cold winter.
In the winter. Yeah. And that stimulates bud break, so growth and yield, which obviously means you get more fruit. So that's very important. And there is a synthetic input used conventionally to stimulate that activity, which is not permitted organically, and that's a factor in the biggest kiwi fruit producing region in New Zealand, where there is a bit of a lack of winter chilling. They have to use that. And so the absence of that in an organic system in that region means you tend to get a yield penalty.
Basically meaning, sorry to summarize, that the region where most of the kiwis are grown now in New Zealand, either due to climate change or in general, doesn't have that cold winter or doesn't have the cold winter anymore, meaning they have to use a strong chemical or a chemical substance to fake the winter.
That's right.
And meaning that they cannot really switch to organic tomorrow because they would not be able to use that substance, thus won't have the same yields as before.
Correct. Yeah. So guys do convert and eventually get there, but you will, the average yield is lower. And
so you chose to be somewhere else. I mean, that's the target. You chose a region where it does get cold.
Yeah, look, there's no question that the region that we have identified is better for growing organic kiwi fruit. There's just no doubt. And it's because of that extra winter chilling, because actually in the summer, the region I'm talking about has higher heat units. So it's kind of a double whammy. You're getting better winter chilling, but then you're getting more heat through the summer. So it's significant. It essentially means you can deliver conventional type yields, but with the organic premium on top.
And your costs are lower as well. Are your inputs in kiwi production, is that a big difference? Or
well, your cost of license is cheaper. Your production is high value. The actual operating cost is similar. So there's not a marked difference between the two. It'll depend on what you're specifically doing with your management system. We think there is some scope to be lower in cost of production if you can set the system up right. And that's what's attractive. One of the attractive things about doing a bare land development. And if you're actually going to secure gold organic license, you actually have to have a bare land development. So
what does that mean?
Take existing kiwi fruit in the ground and cut across to gold under an organic system. It has to be bare land development.
What does that development, you mentioned a specific type, B&L development, what does that mean?
So I'm really just meaning, literally bare land.
So really from the ground up, starting from zero.
Yeah.
How long does it take before the vines are not doing grapes, but doing kiwi fruits?
Yeah, so you'll get a harvest in year 3. Okay. It won't be a really proper commercial harvest. You'll get a more commercial type harvest in year 4. You'd still expect to increase from that point on for a few years, but yeah, you'll. And
when does it mature, or is there a certain moment it goes down again?
It doesn't go down. They sort of go on forever. They're absolute monsters, kiwi fruit. They're just beasts. So they can be a little susceptible to wet feet and to wind, but the way you develop them, you have sort of nets and shelter and so on and so forth. So they're very well protected from wind, and it's obviously important to find out about your soils that they're going into, that they're free draining, fertile and free draining, because wet feet are not good for kiwi fruit. But if you have those variables in place, as I say, they're monsters.
And in terms of soil, what's their impact on the soil? Is there fertilizer necessary? What kind of, are you doing any intercropping? Is it a monoculture plant? How does the kiwi fruit plant feel, or vine feels happy?
Yeah, so obviously it is largely a monoculture because it's a permanent crop. But within that, we look at doing a lot of different things in between the rows. You can sow, legume like clover, and then you go through and cut it and have it so that it shoots out of the mower under the vines. So you're getting a mulch, which is obviously got nitrogen in it. You can also plant plants that will attract beneficial insects, so buckwheat and phacida and things like that. So there are different things you can do, and one of the things we're very interested in doing, which would be quite new and innovative, is to plant habitat around the outside, so it acts as shelter, but also as a habitat for beneficial insects. To sort of create that reservoir, if you like, of beneficial biodiversity. And we're quite interested in doing that. And because kiwi fruit aren't necessarily the sexiest plants for pollinators. So you need to do your best to create an environment where pollinators are motivated to stay there and spend some time there. So that's part of what we seek to do with the system as well, which isn't generally otherwise done as a deliberate action in setting up the system. But that's what I was talking about in terms of setting up a sort of a purpose-built system for organic performance, for organic production.
And in terms of the structure, obviously without giving investment advice, which is not what we're doing, but what are you looking, you're looking to develop a farm basically from the ground up. You have an interesting team here. What's in terms of the investor, putting my investor hat on, what's in terms of the impact investment, what's the structure you're looking for? Is this a one-off thing? Are you going to do multiple? What do you see if we talk in a few years from now and the first one has its first semi-commercial harvest? What would you be looking at?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's not easy to deploy big chunks of capital into kiwi fruit. The average size of a kiwi fruit orchard in New Zealand is something like 2.8 or 3 hectares for a gold orchard. Wow. So it's very small. That said, one of the developments we're looking at would be about 15 hectares under canopy, would actually be quite large in a particular region. I think it would be the second largest individual holding. So,
and canopy here, just to be clear, means canopy of trees or canopy of nets?
Yeah, so it's canopy means, if you like, the area that's got vines growing.
Okay.
And so we think of it as a netted area because we have nets over the top. But basically, canopy is really referring to the kiwi fruit. So where you can see all of those sort of leaves. Because if you're standing under a kiwi fruit in the sort of the peak of the season, as it were, there's not a lot of light coming through. It's quite sort of a lot darker.
And the nets you put for birds, or what's the purpose of the nets?
Wind is the biggest thing. It's a bit of a help with birds, obviously, but primarily it's wind.
And would it be, because I've seen systems on, I think Propagate Ventures was sharing a system for, I don't remember if it was apples or something, but in I think in Argentina, where they planted a lot of very high trees around certain apple farms. So they basically caught the wind. So they created nets, but on the side and made of trees. And they've been doing that for 20 or 30, or I think even much longer, without netting it. Basically, they managed to slow down the wind that came through their orchards because it was such probably the same with kiwis, it's such a threat. But not from above, but basically on the side to block it.
Historically, they've had trees around them, but some of the first trees they used to plant, they found they were havens for a pest. The pest really loved to live on that tree, and then they'd sort of jump into the orchard, so that wasn't quite so successful. So, they've learned a lot more about that. But the nets are extremely effective. As I say, we will utilize trees as well, or perhaps, shrubs might be a way to put it.
For the insect part.
Trees, but ones that will create habitat, using a lot of native plants and so on and so forth. So
just sorry, there was just a side, just to come back to the structure, you'll be doing a one-off for now. Is it, depending on that, you'll be doing more?
Yeah, that's right. At the moment, we've got a one-off project, but there are other opportunities coming up in the pipeline. As I say, look, you're not going to deploy big institutional type amounts of money into kiwi fruit in New Zealand. So if you are thinking the type of investor who might look at this, it might be, high net worths and family offices and those types of investors. Because, look, one or two projects, but there will be the opportunity over time, I imagine, given what we're seeing. That's our expectation, that there will be other assets come up. But from an offshore capital point of view, bare land development works as well as it does from the production sort of point of view and the license point of view. And that's because you have the Overseas Investment Office to go through here in New Zealand. So that's a process, and there are boxes that have to be ticked.
Yeah,
so
of course.
You're adding a lot of value to land if you develop land from bare land into kiwi fruit.
Yeah, because currently the land is used for either cattle or it's bare land, right?
Yeah, well, the sort of land we're looking at is it's either grazing, it's got animals grazing on it, or it's being cropped for animal feed. Other properties, they might be doing some annual cropping, possibly onions or something like that. But whatever it is you're doing, you're still taking it and turning it into a much higher value product or land use by you turning it to kiwi fruit.
Great. I think we're going to switch to a much, much bigger project you're working on, which is actually Project Regeneration, which obviously caught my attention. So let's go to that. So you mentioned dairy a couple of times, or we mentioned dairy actually a couple of times, and we have a nice overview of a number of dairy operations here. It's a huge industry in New Zealand. It's a big part of your economy. You're the 30% of all dairy exported in the world probably comes from your place in the world. What are the main issues? Why is this such an interesting space for, let's say, an impact investor to get involved, and why are you focusing on the dairy industry?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of reasons why we're focusing on dairy. One is it's the biggest industry in the agricultural sector in New Zealand, and by some way. The second thing would be that it has a reputation for being dirty and polluting. So,
as we can see in this river here,
dairy is referred to as dirty dairying. And there has been a dramatic fall in water quality in these sort of catchments where dairy intensification has increased over a relatively short period of time. We're not talking sort of 50 years, we're talking more like sort of 20 years. And so that is becoming socially unacceptable.
Yeah, I was just going to switch to the slide where you share a bit more about that. Like peak cow is, I think, the first time I've seen that somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that some of those headlines, and this is coming from the Minister of the Environment and the Minister for Primary Industries or for Agriculture, in effect, sort of saying, we pretty much think we've reached peak cow. So basically, there's this mood of change, if you like, and it's being brought about also by actual regulation. So nutrient loads are being capped, and so the change is coming, which is a good thing. A lot of farmers don't think it is, but we saw that was created an opportunity because, where someone sees, oh no, it's all changing and it's bad, we'll have to leave. Well, we see opportunity in that rather than something to run away from. And the opportunity is to go and acquire farms, transform those into regenerative systems that are generating better environmental outcomes, but also, good financial outcomes, and make people sort of take a different view on farming, that it doesn't have to be about just making dollars and sort of, abusing the environment, that actually we can make that environmental outcome sort of better. We can deliver better biodiversity. We can improve water quality from where it is now and still make money and make, milk that is high value. So create better financial outcomes as well as environmental. I think it's, intellectually we reject that concept that there is a trade-off between environment and profitability. We see the two actually as linked. You do a better job of the environmental and you will achieve a better outcome on the financial. And frankly, it has to happen. The environmental consequence is no longer something that can just be swept aside or classified as someone else's problem. That has to be deliberately confronted, and regulators are seeking to confront it and deal with it. And that's the environment we go into. And so that's why it's a good time, in our view, to be looking at dairy.
Yeah, so basically you're going in and is it going to be one watershed or one region where, because obviously if you're all sharing the same river with all the farmers in a region, maybe the farm you pick or that's for sale, you buy, you turn into Beyond Organic or Organic Regenerative. Are you figuring out also which farm to pick to have the most impact on that river, or is that something you're thinking about, how to have that ecosystem or watershed level thinking? Where are those, I call it in the show every time, acupuncture points where you can have the most potential impact? Is that something you're thinking of?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And certainly with the project we're looking at the moment, it's very much focused on a catchment. Now, obviously there are neighbouring catchments that you can look to as well, but it is focused on a particular catchment. And then, we're looking to work in closely with those who have been studying those areas, particularly the regulators, I'm thinking, have been recording a lot of information and will have very good insight as to, those key areas. But, certainly we're looking to, so we target farms, for instance, that will have waterways going through them, which isn't actually that challenging to find necessarily in New Zealand, and particularly in this particular catchment. So there's a real opportunity to make a difference there. But that kind of insight is really useful and valuable. And I think the way we will do that in this situation is through that sort of collective approach, so working in with other stakeholders in the catchments. And that's the great thing at the moment. There is appetite to make a difference in how we go about doing that. And historically, it's always sort of been a bit of a stick, oh, you must stop doing this and stop doing that. And, that's achieved a certain amount. But this becomes, I think, a much more powerful sort of driver of change and deliverer of improved outcomes. But it's a really good question. But we do try and specifically target areas and even farms that will have an above the line degree of improvement and impact.
And in terms of, let's say you buy a farm and I would see it the first day or the day before you bought it, and 5 years later, what are the main differences apart from getting the organic certification? What would I see as main differences? Are different grazing? Are there going to be trees? Are the cows looking different? Are there different types of cows? If a farmer would visit, because I obviously don't see too many differences. I mean, I would see a tree, but if a farmer would visit, and what would he or she see in like a couple of years? What would be the whoa, okay, that I didn't expect, or that's completely different from what I know?
Cows will have really big smiles on their faces, and they'll be much happier. You'll see that. But no, and look, in reality, you will notice dramatically different looking pasture and the number of species in that pasture.
Going from what to what? What's your goal, and what are they now?
Well, generally you'll be going from potentially just pure ryegrass or ryegrass with a little bit of white clover to, so let's say 2 varieties, to something that might have 15 or 20 different species in it. So a variety of clovers, maybe some lucerne, bits for trefoil, chicory, plantain.
You plant that in, or it comes back naturally?
Yeah. So you have a rotation. So you don't go in year one and sort of, plow up everything and sow new grass. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling to feed your animals. But you'll have a system of renewal, and you might accelerate that a little bit. You might increase it a little bit, but broadly, you will operate on that rotation of renewal to bring the new pasture in. And you'll also find to an extent that once you have a level of that new pasture in, the cows will also start to help spread it around the farm. I mean, or whatever livestock system you have, that would happen. So, yeah, that's how you make it sort of work. So that's something you will notice as a difference. Trees, you'll see a lot more trees on farms that we're operating, and that might be natives up into scrappy, steep gullies that aren't terribly productive. Could be plantations in those areas. Could be more of a silver pastoral type system where you have rows of whatever it might be. Could be apple trees, could be timber trees, could be nut trees in paddocks.
Is that something that happens already a lot? Is that something you see in New Zealand, or that's pretty new? Because the pictures I've seen, the picture you shared in the presentation, there's hardly a tree inside.
Yeah. No, particularly New Zealand dairy farms, historically it's always been seen that if you had a tree, it meant it was growing somewhere that couldn't grow grass. So you had to get rid of the tree so you could grow more grass. The idea of sort of shelter for the animals and, these sort of things just didn't come into the equation. That's starting to change. And so people are starting to sort of see trees maybe as being an asset, which obviously they are. So, but you will see a lot more trees on farms and in ways that you wouldn't normally expect to see trees on farms as well. So, I mean, people will talk about riparian planting in New Zealand, but we will do that and to a high level. And I don't just mean lots of it, but in terms of thinking about the species we are putting in place and what else are they doing apart from retaining nutrient, because there's only so much they're doing at that point. When you're a metre or two away from the river, there's only so much they're sort of doing. But so, well, what else? What are the other benefits we're getting out of those sort of systems? And are there other things we can plant? So, we've talked in the past, you and I, about medicinal type plantings, so that animals can self-medicate, and other sources of fodder, as well as the shelter and, just rubbing posts, this type of thing. So there's, trees are pretty cool things. There are a lot of ways we can use them. There's a real drive to see more trees being planted in this country. There's the carbon factor and the ability to drive, more income out of the use of trees as well. So there's a lot of compelling reasons, and that's a definite way you're going to see a physical difference on the farm. Look, another way might be that you change the breed of livestock you're dealing with. So I don't mean radically changing it from dairy cows to something else, but I mean the breed of cow you're utilising, you may change in order to have a better adapted animal for an organic system. So one that's quite robust, produces off fodder, resilient, calves easily, and all those sort of good qualities that you want in an organic system.
And in terms of the, we call them, what is the Botox cows or whatever you give them. Yeah, they probably won't survive very well in a few more trees, some fodder, and some herbal plants. They wouldn't know what to do with that. And in terms of the other end, on the sales part, I mean, I read here there are two main companies, one cooperative and the other not. You can sell to. Is there any direct market? Is there any margins apart from the organic premium you're thinking about? Like at some point, is there going to be a more farm to fork to come back to your family's business previously? Is there more of a direct link? Is there something that you can play with in New Zealand, or because it's export, you have to go through these big players because otherwise you can't?
Yeah, it's a great idea, and one I always loved in the UK, but the reality is we just don't have the population here. I think if you're very close to a significant town, and particularly if you're close to a tourist type town in New Zealand, then that can work, I think. And if you're a relatively smaller artisan type thing, but the scale of farms we're talking about here are quite, these are pretty big farms. These are 800 cow type farms. So the locals have got to drink a lot of that milk to make it stack up, and also to pay a pretty good price for it as well. So reality is the nature of New Zealand is such that it's always going to be focused on export. And, I think that's important.
So you're going to be more of a price taker than a price giver because
yes. I mean, to an extent with the processor. We are talking, and this is more of a North Island conversation than South Island, and our focus tends to be South Island, but there are some organisations in the North Island who are looking to capture much more of that value through higher value products and to get that back to the farmer. So we have talked to the process in the South Island about that, and I think there is a degree of appetite around creating a better share in the value that is available to high.
Yeah, because if you're creating absolutely great milk with different protein levels, different nutrient levels, and much happier cows that hopefully give much better milk, it's almost a shame if that value is taken either by the processor or then by the marketing company. But if that's the case, then that's the case. I mean, there's not too much you can do about it. But you see a lot of other regenerative farmers that at some point, maybe they're into grain, they start a mill, or at some point they try to capture, or with a few others, they start a processor themselves. But I haven't seen anything, honestly, in dairy on that thing. And obviously you have a very particular logistical situation as you export most of it. So there's a difference there, but you can see that movement in a lot of places, but maybe it's too difficult for you at the moment.
No, I do think there's the opportunity to do that. And I think we'll probably start to see that increase, because I know that there is capital that is interested in much more of that vertical integration, of that extending through the value chain and not just owning the farming asset and producing the milk, but in sort of processing it and then putting it into supermarkets in Asia or into North America or wherever it might be. And it's a good thing for us to look to do, or to at least capture that, because the value available through an organic product is, really, really very, very significant. There's a lot of margin in there to be captured, and for farmers to be rewarded. So it's a compelling prospect for us to sort of work to sort of capture more of that.
And in terms of structure, this is very, very different from the kiwi structure we discussed previously. This is much bigger opportunity. Your plan is to buy many farms and to really build a portfolio, which also makes sense for potential institutional investors, right? That's what I read, at least through these slides.
Yeah. Well, look, the opportunity, because of the market conditions at the moment, because of size of individual farms, because of the size of the market, is such that you can deploy a lot of capital and in quite good time into dairying in New Zealand. I think it's pretty much exclusively into this kind of transformational regenerative approach. I think if you're offshore capital, you will struggle to deploy capital into conventional.
Why is that?
The Overseas Investment Office.
They have to basically agree on every investment, and they're much more likely to go for this type?
Yeah, above 4 hectares. And there aren't too many dairy farms in New Zealand smaller than 4 hectares. So, yeah. And just to give you an idea, look, we're talking about, as I said, 800 cow type farms, $15.5 million to buy the farm, the cows, and everything else you need. So, these are not small assets, but it's quite a compelling sort of setup, the nature of the market, because of availability, because of valuations, because of the nature of the organic market, and because of some of these pressures coming on through regulation, the aging farmer population, the high levels of debt at the farm gate. There are a lot of reasons which make it very interesting to look at the moment. And as I say, from that regenerative, if that's your strategy, and if that's not your strategy, then I think you really need to sort of move on and look at other things or other places. But if you're adopting a regenerative approach, and it's measurable and articulated, and one that is genuinely inclusive with stakeholders in those catchments, then I think it becomes far more plausible, or it becomes an executable sort of strategy, as opposed to one that has had its time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, as it's such a specific case. It's mostly export, and it seems to be mostly potential investments coming from overseas. So it's a very particular case when you look at the global agriculture market, and that makes it. But you've always had that interaction. It's always been for export, and I think lots of the money. I think we had a discussion previously as well on the local impact investing sector, which doesn't really exist yet or starting to emerge, but it's mostly Australia or mostly further away. And that's actually how we got connected as well. So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
You're going?
That's right. New Zealand is small. There's 4 million people, 4.5 million people, and so that means there's a small number of large investors. I mean, very small. The capital isn't that big. So to rely on domestic capital alone to drive impact type outcomes, it's starting at a small level to happen, that's for sure. But relative to offshore capital, there's no comparison. So.
Yeah, so I stopped the sharing. I would like to end with a final question. I see that actually time has flown.
Okay.
If you could wave your magic wand and tomorrow morning we wake up, or in a few hours, because in your case it's already evening, what would you like to change in the ag or regenerative ag and the impact investing space? What would be your point to that? What would you wake up tomorrow and think, Geoff changed something?
Yeah, I would like to see a lot more capital being deployed into the regenerative ag sector and into making change happen, because there is a lot of discussion about this. There's a lot of ESG reports produced. There's a lot of even media coverage. But in terms of the actual activity on the ground, I mean, I think I literally know all the regenerative ag investment guys in the Western world. And I could probably have them over for a dinner party. There might be one I'm missing out or two, but, 2 or 3 of the 4 of those guys, and that's about all there is. I know them extremely well. And they're all great guys.
Girls,
or girls, of course. Yeah, the ones I know all actually are guys, but there might be girls out there as well.
Which is an issue on my show, I have to be honest. Yeah, I want much more gender diversity, because in the impact investing space, it's much more balanced. But somehow, as soon as you get to agriculture, it loses that gender balance completely, which is really annoying. So anybody listening or watching and knows any great people to interview, please think about gender balance, because I need that much better on the show. If you scroll down on the SoundCloud list, it's quite embarrassing actually. But so you would change that, but how would you do that? What would be the main?
Look, there's, as I say, there's
how do we wake up the investors
going into traditional conventional agriculture that is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And where there's some very capable people doing great things in the regenerative space, and it would be good to see those guys being rewarded for their vision and their passion and their ability to make change happen.
And what do you think is how could we do that? I mean, the magic wand is probably not going to work. I'm sorry to burst that bubble, but what would be one thing to wake up investors for soil, or to even maybe the other part to see the risks they're putting to work now while they're investing in conventional chemical agriculture? What would you think is the main leverage point we have?
Well, yeah, that's tough.
That's a whole other hour.
Yeah. Days. I think all you can do is talk to facts, to what you know, to describe the situation, and then you need to find the right people. So you need to find the people who will be willing to support that and to whom it is important to support. And I think that's increasing. I think, say, particularly out of Northern Europe, or say out of families who are getting that generational change, these types of things are becoming important. And so they become less of a nice to have and more of an essential to have. And I think I'm hoping that's where we'll start to see some sort of change being driven through that process. But otherwise it's, it is challenging. It becomes a case of, articulating the story over and over again, finding people who understand it, and who have a desire to pursue it. Whether that desire is based on motivation around wanting to drive environmental change, or whether it's just recognition that, hey, this is a really good idea, and there's this big trend sort of moving this way in the world anyway, so we might as well get on board because we could make some money. My view is if people want to pursue it because they just want to make money, well, that's great, because it's still doing the right thing. And I hope that they then like all the other sort of stuff as well. But yeah, I just, those are the kinds of things that I think are driving the change. Well, that's what we need to see more of.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's it really goes against many things that we've learned and seen in agriculture, and to question that or saying we can go much further than that is really difficult for people to get into their head. Like, now I've seen an organic farm and the farmer was really struggling. So I know that organic farmers are struggling, and we're never going to feed the world with that. It's like, yeah, but I've seen others. And so it's a very, very difficult narrative to get through. But the narrative is very strong and very good. And I think with the regulations that are now happening, it's a very interesting point in New Zealand that the outside pressure is going to be stronger. And there is a huge pull factor because the export market is so interested in this stuff. So that hopefully it's like an inflection point. So I want to thank you so much for your time. It was great to learn more on New Zealand, more on kiwi fruits that I never knew before, more on dairy, and of course to see like quite a particular but very interesting agriculture situation and impact investing situation where both the export is the key driver, but also the import or the investment coming from overseas. So you have those two pooling points basically working together. So it was great spending your evening. Thank you so much for taking the time this Monday evening. And I hope to check in with you soon again and learn much more on other projects you're working on.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Koen, and so nice to catch up. And I hope to speak again soon.
And thank you for being part of this experiment. So,
yeah, it's been great. Loved it. Enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end. I hope you found it interesting, relevant, and learned something new about it. Quite an exciting place we don't hear enough about when it comes to regenerative agriculture. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.